The last Apache woman lived in a land of endless hills and wide skies, where the wind whispered secrets among the rocks and the sun painted golden light over the earth. Her name was not widely known, for she had spent her life quietly among her family and her people, learning the ways of the land and the stories of her ancestors. She was young, with eyes that held both curiosity and wisdom, the kind of eyes that seemed to understand more than they should for her years. Her people had taught her the songs of the wind, the language of the rivers, and the courage to face whatever life might bring. Her village was small but alive with laughter, chatter, and the simple joys of daily life. Children ran barefoot over the soft earth, their laughter echoing through the canyons, while elders sat by the fires, speaking in low, comforting voices about the lessons of the past. The last Apache woman spent her days helping her family, gathering herbs, and learning the skills that would one day make her a wise woman of the tribe. There was a sense of freedom here, a feeling that life was connected to the land and to the people around her in a way that made every day meaningful. But freedom is often fragile, and danger can arrive in the quietest of ways. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the hills, the village heard a sound that made their hearts freeze. Distant, at first, it grew into the unmistakable clatter of hooves and shouting voices. Outsiders had come, and the peace of the village was about to shatter. The last Apache woman watched from behind a rock, her heart pounding in her chest as the attackers descended upon her home. They were ruthless, with no thought for life or tradition, taking what they wanted and destroying what they could not use. Her family tried to protect what remained, but they were outnumbered and overwhelmed. Screams filled the air, the sound of breaking wood and falling bodies echoing through the valley. She could only clutch her shawl and hide, praying to the spirits of her ancestors for protection. Within moments, her world had turned upside down. Her family was separated, her home destroyed, and she was seized by hands that did not care about her cries. She was pushed into a rough cart and taken away, her mind racing with fear, anger, and confusion. The landscape she had known all her life disappeared behind her as the cart rolled over hills and across plains. She did not know where they were taking her, but the fear of the unknown pressed down on her like a heavy stone. At the next settlement, she was brought to a crowded market. The place smelled of dust, animals, and smoke, and it was filled with the noise of people shouting and bargaining. She was placed on a raised platform, and the crowd around her began to inspect her, as if she were an object to be traded, rather than a living, breathing person. Her stomach twisted in fear and shame, but she held her head high, refusing to let them see the full measure of her terror. She remembered the lessons of her people. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to face it. The bidding began. Voices called out, and silver coins were thrown onto a wooden table. 6 silver dollars. That was the sum for which she was sold. 6 small coins for a human life. 6 pieces of metal for the worth of her spirit, her freedom, her family. The injustice of it burned in her chest, and she could not stop the tears from forming in her eyes. But she forced them back, knowing that showing weakness would only make her situation worse. The man who had purchased her was rough and impatient. He did not speak kindly, nor did he seem to care about her thoughts or feelings. She realized quickly that her life had been reduced to a simple exchange, and that survival would now require patience, cunning, and resilience. She was taken from the market and led to a small, cramped dwelling that would serve as her new home, a place without warmth, without comfort, and without the love that she had once known. Days passed slowly. The last Apache woman had to adjust to the harsh reality of her captivity. She was expected to obey without question, to perform tasks she had never imagined, and to remain silent when the men around her spoke harshly. Every movement, every word, was scrutinized. But she did not let despair take root in her heart. She remembered the stories her mother had told her, of ancestors who had faced unimaginable hardships and yet endured with strength and dignity. She whispered those stories to herself in the dark, letting them keep her spirit alive. Even in captivity, she found small ways to resist. She would tend to a small garden outside her dwelling, planting herbs and flowers she had known as a child. She would watch the sky at dawn and dusk, noticing the colors change and feeling the wind on her face. Small reminders that she was still alive and that life could still hold beauty. She observed the routines of her captors, learned their habits, and quietly planned how she might one day regain her freedom. Every glance, every careful movement, became a small act of defiance, a silent assertion that her spirit could not be sold or chained. At night, when the house grew quiet and the stars appeared overhead, she would dream. She dreamed of her family, of the rolling hills of her home, of the songs she had learned as a child. She dreamed of freedom, of running through the valleys without fear, of speaking her own words without restraint. Those dreams kept her alive. They reminded her that though she was imprisoned in body, her mind and soul could not be captured. Even as she faced this hardship, the last Apache woman noticed things about the world she had never seen before. The people in the settlement were different from those in her village, with their own fears and desires. Some were cruel, but others showed small acts of kindness, offering a smile or a word that carried more warmth than the coins that had bought her. She began to understand the complexities of human nature, that even in a world filled with injustice, there could still be moments of compassion. And then, one day, a rumor reached her ears, a story about a man who traveled alone, a stranger with a past as broken as her own. People whispered about him with curiosity and caution. She did not know if the tales were true, but a small spark of hope flickered in her heart. Perhaps, in a world that had taken so much from her, there was someone who could see her not as property, but as a person. Perhaps there was a way out of the despair that had become her daily companion. The last Apache woman understood that survival would require more than endurance. It would require courage, careful observation, and the ability to recognize opportunities when they arose. She began to watch and wait, learning the routines of those around her, noting the times when doors were left unguarded or when the world seemed quieter. Each day, she strengthened her resolve, building a plan in her mind even if she could not yet see how it would unfold. Though she was alone in many ways, she carried her heritage with her. The songs, stories, and lessons of her people were not lost. They lived in her heart and gave her strength. She whispered them quietly when no one was listening, letting the words remind her of who she was and what she could endure. Every hardship she faced became a testament to the resilience that had been passed down through generations. And so, the last Apache woman waited. She waited for a chance, for a moment, for someone who might recognize her humanity and help her reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. She did not yet know what the future held, but she knew one thing with certainty. She would not be broken. Not entirely. The fire within her spirit, though tested, still burned, and that fire would guide her, even in the darkest moments, toward the hope of freedom and the possibility of a life reclaimed. Life in captivity settled into a harsh routine for the last Apache woman. Yet she refused to let it crush her spirit. Each day she woke to the same dull gray walls, the same rough floor beneath her feet, and the same indifferent faces around her. The world of her village, once alive with laughter and freedom, seemed like a distant dream. But even in this confined life, she found ways to survive, to remain herself, and to nurture the faint spark of hope that still burned inside her. Her captors demanded obedience. She carried out chores without complaint, tending to the house and preparing meals, though her hands longed for the soil of her homeland and the work she had done with love. She swept the floors with a quiet grace, washed dishes with care, and organized the small living space as best she could. She noticed that even the smallest acts of diligence earned a nod of approval from those around her, though their eyes never truly saw her as a person. Despite the monotony, she made the walls of her confinement her own in subtle ways. She placed herbs and wildflowers in small clay pots, remembering the sense of home and the lessons of her mother. Each plant became a quiet act of rebellion against the dullness and cruelty surrounding her. She would talk to them softly in the evenings, sharing stories of the wind, the mountains, and the songs of her people. These conversations, though silent to anyone else, kept her connected to life beyond the walls. At night, she lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of the settlement. the clatter of hooves, the murmur of voices, and the occasional laughter that carried over the rooftops. Sometimes, she imagined herself moving among those streets as a free woman, walking without fear, and speaking her own words. In her mind, she traced the contours of the hills she had once known, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the wind in her hair. These imaginings were more than dreams. They were reminders that her spirit was still alive and untamed. She also observed the people who came and went, learning their habits and understanding their weaknesses. She noticed that the guards were predictable in their routines, that the merchants often became distracted by their own dealings, and that the townspeople could be swayed by simple gestures. Knowledge became her ally, a tool she used to navigate her confinement with intelligence and caution. Even in captivity, she was learning, growing stronger in ways that her captors could never anticipate. Sometimes, she caught the gaze of other women in the settlement, women who lived under similar restrictions and hardships. They spoke little, but their eyes shared understanding. A nod, a glance, a fleeting smile, these small signs of solidarity became a source of comfort for her. She began to realize that even in a world where cruelty was common, compassion could still be found, and strength could be shared quietly, without words. The last Apache woman also found time to practice the skills she had learned as a child. She whispered the songs of her ancestors under her breath, tracing patterns in the dirt with her fingers, and repeating the stories of the wind and the mountains. These small acts kept her identity alive. They reminded her that she was not merely a possession or a shadow of someone else's life, but a person with a history, a culture, and a soul that could never be taken entirely. Yet there were moments when despair threatened to overwhelm her. Loneliness pressed in, and the memories of her family tugged painfully at her heart. She would sit by the window, staring at the distant horizon, imagining her mother, father, and siblings in the village, hoping that somehow they were still alive. Tears would sometimes fall silently, but she never let them be seen by the others. She knew that showing weakness could only make her life more difficult. One evening, as she sat watching the sun dip below the distant hills, she heard whispers in the settlement about a stranger who had arrived in town. People spoke of him quietly, as if afraid that mentioning his name aloud might summon trouble. He was a man with a heavy past, marked by experiences that had left him broken in ways most could not understand. But he carried a quiet strength and an air of honesty that made people take notice. The last Apache woman's curiosity was piqued. Perhaps this man was different from the rest. Perhaps he was someone who could see her as she truly was. Days passed, and she observed the stranger from afar whenever she could. She noticed the careful way he moved through the streets, the kindness in his gestures, and the way he seemed to pay attention to the world around him, rather than simply passing through. He did not treat the people he met with arrogance or cruelty. There was something in his presence that stirred a glimmer of hope within her, a feeling she had almost forgotten. As she watched him, she also became aware of her own courage. She realized that despite her captivity, she had not allowed her spirit to be fully tamed. She could endure the chores, the monotony, and the harsh words, and yet still find ways to nurture herself, to learn, and to observe. She understood that hope was not passive. It required vigilance, patience, and a willingness to recognize opportunities when they appeared. Her routine began to include small experiments. She would test the boundaries of her confinement, noticing which doors were left unlocked at certain times, where the guards' attention wavered, and how the settlement operated when no one was watching. Every piece of information she gathered became part of an invisible map, a preparation for a future moment when she might reclaim her freedom. She was not simply waiting. She was planning, observing, and preparing. Even if she did not yet know when the right moment would come, despite the hardships, she found moments of quiet joy. A sudden breeze that carried the scent of flowers reminded her of home. The laughter of a child in the streets brought a small smile to her lips. A simple act of kindness from a fellow captive, a shared meal, a whispered word of encouragement lifted her spirits. These fleeting moments reminded her that life could still hold beauty, even in a world filled with injustice. She also began to reflect on the lessons she had learned in her village. Her people had always emphasized patience, resilience, and courage. They had taught her that strength was not only physical but also mental and spiritual. In captivity, she realized that these lessons were more valuable than ever. Each day she faced her challenges with a quiet determination, reminding herself that her spirit could not be bought, sold, or broken. The more she observed the stranger, the more she felt a connection, even without words. There was a sense that he understood suffering, that he carried his own burdens, and that he might be someone who could help her find a path to freedom. She did not yet know if he would, or if it was even safe to trust him. But the possibility of an ally sparked a cautious optimism. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond these walls, a life where she could walk freely, speak openly, and reclaim the dignity that had been stripped from her. She also reflected on her own strength. Captivity had not made her weak. It had revealed her resilience. She could endure hardship, observe carefully, and hold on to hope. Every day, she became more confident in her ability to navigate the world. Even if the world seemed cruel and unfair, she knew that survival required more than patience. It required courage, intelligence, and the ability to act when the moment was right. As the days turned into weeks, the last Apache woman's resolve deepened. She continued her work, tended to her small garden, and maintained her rituals of remembrance and hope. She listened to the whispers of the wind, remembered the songs of her ancestors, and held tightly to the belief that freedom was still possible. Even in the darkest hours, she refused to surrender entirely to despair. And though she remained cautious, she allowed herself to think about the stranger and the possibility that he might help her. She did not yet know how or when, but the seed of hope had been planted. She could imagine a future where she walked once again among the hills and valleys of her homeland, where her voice could be heard and where her spirit could soar freely. That vision became her guide, her secret companion in the long days of captivity, reminding her that she was not yet defeated, and that even in the midst of suffering, courage and hope could endure. The stranger had arrived quietly, almost like a shadow moving through the settlement. No one seemed to know where he had come from, and few dared to ask. He walked with a slight limp, a mark of a life filled with hardship, and his eyes carried the weight of experiences that had left him cautious and careful. Yet, there was a steadiness to him, a quiet confidence that made people pause and take notice. Even in his brokenness, there was strength, and the last Apache woman sensed it before she ever met him. At first, she only saw him from afar. From the small window of her dwelling, she watched him as he moved among the townspeople, offering help when it was needed, listening when others spoke, and never demanding attention for himself. Unlike the other men she had seen since her capture, he did not treat women with indifference or cruelty. He seemed to notice them, to respect their presence, even if he never said much. This small difference intrigued her. It gave her hope that perhaps not all men were the same, that there were still people in the world who could see her as a person, not property. Their first meeting was unplanned and brief, yet it left a lasting impression. She had been gathering water from the small well behind her dwelling when the stranger passed by. He offered her a simple nod and a word of greeting. "Good evening," he said, his voice quiet but warm. She had been startled by the kindness, and for a moment, her heart skipped. She returned the greeting cautiously, unsure if it was safe to respond, but she felt a strange sense of relief in his presence. For the first time in weeks, she sensed a hint of trust, a fragile connection forming between two broken souls. In the days that followed, she observed him more closely. He did not linger in the settlement for long, yet he returned with some regularity, moving silently through the streets, as if he belonged to no one and nothing. She noticed the way he carried himself with careful awareness, avoiding unnecessary conflict and helping quietly when it was needed. He seemed to understand suffering in a way that few others did, and she began to wonder if he had experienced loss as profound as her own. In her mind, she imagined conversations they might have, though she knew the risk of speaking too freely in her captivity. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with shades of gold and red. The stranger passed by her dwelling again. This time, he paused, as if sensing her presence. He looked directly at her window and offered a small, reassuring smile. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a reminder that there were still people in the world who could see beyond appearances, beyond fear, and recognize the humanity in another. That brief gesture was enough to give her courage, to strengthen the resolve she had cultivated in the long weeks of captivity. Over time, their encounters grew slightly bolder. The stranger would leave small gifts in places she could find. A piece of bread, a cloth to mend her worn clothing, a simple flower he had picked along the road. Each gesture was carefully done so that no one else would notice, and each act filled her with a quiet gratitude and hope. She began to see him not just as a stranger, but as someone who might help her reclaim the life that had been stolen. He was patient, careful, and unassuming. But his presence was a lifeline in a world that had seemed endlessly cruel. The last Apache woman, too, began to take small risks. She would leave notes in places he could find, written in a secret code of symbols and marks she had learned from her people. She did not know if he would understand them, but she trusted that his careful nature would allow him to see the meaning behind her gestures. In this quiet, almost invisible exchange, a bond began to form. It was built not on words alone, but on mutual understanding, shared suffering, and the recognition of resilience in the other. One day, the stranger approached her directly. He had chosen a moment when no one else was watching, and he spoke in a low, careful voice. "I know your heart is not yours to give," he said gently, "and yet I see your courage. You are not like the others. I will help you, if you trust me." Her heart pounded in her chest, both with fear and hope. She had learned to be cautious, to guard herself, but she also sensed that this man's offer was genuine. After a long pause, she nodded slightly, signaling that she would trust him, at least enough to listen. From that moment, they began to plan quietly. Every word had to be measured, every movement carefully considered. She shared with him what she had learned about the routines of the settlement, when the doors were left unguarded, which paths were safest, and how the guards tended to their tasks. He listened attentively, never interrupting, never rushing her. And together, they began to imagine a way for her to escape without drawing attention. The planning was slow and deliberate, but it gave her a sense of agency she had not felt in weeks. As they worked together, the last Apache woman discovered that the stranger carried his own burdens. He had been wounded, not only in body but in spirit, and the world had not been kind to him either. Yet, despite his own pain, he chose to help her. She realized that strength was not the absence of suffering, but the ability to act with compassion, even when one was broken. This understanding deepened her respect and trust for him, and a quiet bond of friendship began to take root. The days grew longer, as they continued their secret preparations. She practiced moving quietly, observing the guards, and finding small ways to test the limits of her confinement. He taught her to notice subtle details, like the patterns of light and shadow, the sounds that signaled movement, and the gestures that indicated attention or distraction. She was learning to combine her natural instincts with his careful guidance, and each lesson strengthened her confidence and resolve. Despite the tension of their situation, there were moments of unexpected warmth. They shared stories quietly, speaking of their pasts in coded ways, of loss and hope, of dreams that had been interrupted but not forgotten. She learned that even broken people could offer kindness and wisdom, and he learned from her resilience and courage. Each encounter, however brief, became a lifeline, a reminder that human connection could exist even in the harshest circumstances. The last Apache woman also began to notice the world around her differently. She saw patterns in the settlement that had previously gone unnoticed, from the way the townspeople moved about their day to the hidden paths that could be used for escape. She discovered small opportunities in what had seemed like a prison, and she realized that freedom was not simply a matter of leaving the walls. It was about understanding the world and acting with intelligence and courage. As the days turned into weeks, their plans slowly took shape. They discussed every detail with care, ensuring that each step would minimize risk. The stranger was patient and attentive, respecting her courage and her insight. She felt a growing sense of empowerment, knowing that she was not simply being led, but was an active participant in reclaiming her life. Every small decision, every careful observation, strengthened her belief that escape was possible. Yet, even as hope grew, fear remained. They both knew that one misstep could undo everything, that the settlement's routines could change at any moment, and that her captors were unpredictable. She felt the weight of responsibility not only for herself but also for the stranger who had chosen to risk his own safety. This awareness sharpened her focus, making every action deliberate, every glance careful, and every word measured. And through it all, a quiet understanding developed between them. They did not need grand gestures or elaborate promises. Their trust was built on small acts, shared observations, and the recognition of each other's strength. She realized that the stranger was more than just a helper. He was someone who understood what it meant to be broken, yet determined to act with integrity. And he, in turn, recognized in her a spirit that refused to be silenced, a courage that shone despite the darkness surrounding her. As Part 3 drew to a close, the last Apache woman felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. The stranger's presence had become a source of hope, a signal that change was possible. She knew that the journey ahead would be dangerous, that escape would require careful planning and unwavering courage. But she also knew that she was not alone, and that this fragile bond might be the key to reclaiming the life she had lost. In the quiet of the night, she looked at the stars and whispered a prayer to the spirits of her ancestors, asking for guidance and protection. She was no longer merely a captive waiting for the days to pass. She was a woman preparing to take control of her destiny, guided by courage, careful planning, and a stranger who, like her, had been shaped by hardship, but refused to be defined by it. The first spark of freedom had been lit, and though the path was uncertain, it promised a future where she could walk once again in the light of her own choices. The day of their escape arrived quietly, as if the world itself held its breath. The last Apache woman had spent weeks preparing for this moment, carefully observing the routines of the settlement and practicing the movements that would carry her to freedom. The stranger had guided her with patience and caution, reminding her that every step must be deliberate and every sound must be measured. Neither of them spoke much in the early hours, for words could be dangerous and alert the wrong people. Instead, they shared understanding in glances, gestures, and the silent agreement that the time for action had come. Before dawn, the last Apache woman dressed in the plainest clothing she owned, the kind that would not draw attention. She carried only what she could hold, small necessities wrapped in a piece of cloth. The stranger had chosen a moment when most of the settlement would be asleep, when the guards' attention would be at its lowest, and when the moon provided just enough light to guide them without revealing their presence. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth and grass, and every sound seemed louder in the quiet of the morning. As they moved through the narrow streets, the last Apache woman's heart beat quickly, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Every shadow seemed to hide danger. Every distant noise could signal discovery. And yet, with each step, she felt the growing thrill of reclaiming her freedom. The stranger led her carefully, pointing out the safest paths and whispering reminders of the routines they had observed. She followed with quiet determination, trusting him completely, knowing that their lives depended on their precision and focus. They reached the first obstacle, the gate that separated the settlement from the open land beyond. The guard stationed there had a predictable pattern, turning his back at intervals that the stranger had carefully noted. Waiting for the right moment, they stepped forward in silence, the last Apache woman holding her breath as their feet moved over the rough stones. The guard did not notice them, distracted by a small conversation on the other side. Relief and hope surged in her chest as they passed through, one careful step at a time, leaving the first barrier behind them. Beyond the gate, the streets grew narrower and less traveled. They moved quickly but cautiously, keeping to the shadows and avoiding any source of light. The settlement was waking now, and the faint sounds of activity reached their ears. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, a door creaked, and the scent of morning fires drifted through the air. Each sound made her pulse race, but she focused on the stranger's calm presence, letting his confidence guide her steps. As they left the settlement, the terrain changed. The smooth paths of the town gave way to uneven ground, rocks, and sparse vegetation. The last Apache woman felt the earth under her feet, the wind brushing her face, and the sun beginning to rise in the distance. She breathed in deeply, savoring the freedom that was so close yet still fragile. Every step was a mixture of fear and hope, and she held tightly to the knowledge that this was her chance to reclaim her life. The first challenge came when they encountered a small patrol of men, moving through the outskirts of the settlement. The stranger stopped immediately, pressing her gently to the ground behind a low wall. They waited in silence, hearts pounding. As the patrol passed without noticing them, the last Apache woman felt her breath catch in her throat, but the stranger's steady hand on her shoulder reminded her to stay calm. Once the danger had passed, they continued, moving faster but still carefully. Knowing that any mistake could mean capture, or worse, they navigated through narrow paths, small streams, and rocky hills. Using the knowledge the last Apache woman had gained during her captivity, she had observed the land from the windows of her dwelling, noticing hidden routes, distant hills, and small clearings that could serve as safe places. Now, she used that knowledge to guide them, blending her instincts with the stranger's careful planning. Each step forward strengthened her confidence, reminding her that she was not helpless and that freedom was within her grasp. As they moved further into the wilderness, they encountered the first true test of endurance. The terrain became more difficult, with steep inclines and thick underbrush. The stranger encouraged her to move carefully, to take slow, steady steps, and to conserve her energy. The last Apache woman's muscles ached, and her breath came in sharp bursts, but she refused to stop. Every moment brought them closer to safety, and the thought of the open land and the hills of her homeland kept her moving forward. Night fell while they were still in the wilderness. The stars began to appear, twinkling above them like distant lanterns, guiding their path. They found a small clearing to rest, hidden from sight, where they could catch their breath and regain their strength. The stranger shared a small piece of bread with her, and she ate it slowly, savoring the taste and the feeling of being alive in a way she had not felt for weeks. They spoke little, for there was no need. Their shared determination and silent understanding were enough. In the days that followed, they moved through forests, across streams, and over rocky hills. The last Apache woman grew stronger with each step, her confidence building as she realized that she was capable of enduring hardship and navigating the world with intelligence and courage. The stranger remained close, offering guidance, protection, and quiet encouragement. She began to see him not just as a helper, but as a companion who understood her, who respected her strength, and who shared in the risks of their journey. At one point, they faced a wide river. The water was cold and fast-moving, and crossing it required careful planning. The stranger scouted the best path, finding a shallow section where the current was slower and the rocks were stable. The last Apache woman followed his lead, stepping carefully from rock to rock, feeling the water rush around her legs. Her heart pounded, but she focused on each step, trusting her instincts and the guidance of her companion. They reached the other side safely, and she felt a surge of triumph and relief, knowing that another obstacle had been overcome. As they continued, they encountered signs of the wider world beyond the settlement, birds in flight, distant mountains, and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Each sight reminded her of the life she had lost and the freedom she was regaining. She spoke little, but her eyes were alive with determination and hope. She felt a growing sense of empowerment, realizing that she was not simply fleeing captivity, but actively reclaiming her life with courage and intelligence. Even as their journey progressed, danger remained close. They had to avoid patrols, navigate rough terrain, and keep their presence hidden from those who might wish them harm. Each challenge tested their endurance and wits, but also strengthened their bond. The stranger's patience, careful planning, and respect for her abilities gave her confidence, while her courage and resourcefulness inspired him. Together, they were stronger than they could have been alone. By the end of the fourth day, They reached a high ridge overlooking the valley where the settlement lay behind them. From this vantage point, the last Apache woman saw the world spread out before her, the hills, forests, and rivers she had once known, and the promise of a life beyond captivity. She felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, joy, and gratitude. They had overcome incredible odds, faced danger with courage, and emerged stronger together. The stranger stood beside her, silent but present, sharing in her triumph without words. In that quiet moment, she understood the full meaning of freedom. It was not simply the absence of chains, but the reclaiming of choice, the ability to act with courage, and the knowledge that her spirit could never be taken. She had faced fear, endured hardship, and trusted in someone who had earned her confidence. And in doing so, she had discovered the strength within herself, a strength that would guide her in the days to come. As night fell over the valley, they made camp in a hidden spot, safe for the moment. The last Apache woman sat by the fire, feeling the warmth on her face and the quiet sense of accomplishment in her heart. She knew the journey ahead was not over. Freedom would require continued vigilance and courage, but for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to truly feel alive. She was no longer merely surviving. She was reclaiming her life, step by step, guided by her instincts, her intelligence, and the quiet strength of the stranger who had helped her along the way. In the stillness of the night, she looked up at the stars and whispered a silent thanks to the spirits of her ancestors. They had guided her through darkness, reminding her of courage, patience, and resilience. She had faced fear, endured hardship, and now, finally, she was moving toward the light of freedom. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, she knew one truth with certainty. She was no longer captive, not in body, and certainly not in spirit. The world was vast, full of possibilities, and she was ready to walk into it as a woman reclaimed, a spirit unbroken, and a life restored. The last Apache woman had crossed the final ridges and descended into the wide, open land that stretched beyond the settlement. The morning sun bathed the hills in gold, and the breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and earth. Every step she took felt lighter, freer, and more purposeful than the days she had spent in captivity. Beside her, the stranger walked quietly, his presence a steady anchor in the vast wilderness. They had survived the journey together, relying on courage, skill, and mutual trust. And now the world felt infinitely larger than it had just days before. Freedom was not simply the absence of chains. It was the ability to breathe deeply, to move without fear, and to choose one's path. The last Apache woman reveled in these sensations, letting the wind sweep through her hair and listening to the sounds of nature she had missed for so long. The hills reminded her of her home. The earth beneath her feet spoke of resilience, and the sky above seemed to promise new beginnings. With each step, she felt herself reclaiming not only her body but also her spirit, which had been tested and strengthened through hardship. The stranger had guided her through the wilderness, offering quiet advice, careful observation, and unwavering support. He did not dictate her movements, nor did he attempt to overshadow her courage. Instead, he walked beside her as an equal, respecting her decisions and recognizing the strength that had carried her this far. She understood, in that moment, that freedom was not only about distance from captivity, but also about finding allies who saw and respected the worth of her spirit. As they traveled, she began to reflect on everything that had happened. The attack on her village, the betrayal and cruelty she had suffered, and the small, glimmering acts of kindness that had given her hope. She thought of her family, wondering if they were alive, and felt the ache of loss, mixed with the determination to honor their memory through her actions. Every hardship she had endured had taught her patience, resilience, and the power of inner strength. She realized that suffering, though painful, could also teach valuable lessons about courage, trust, and the importance of hope. Along the way, they encountered the first signs of a village on the horizon. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of life echoed faintly across the hills. The last Apache woman paused, unsure whether to approach. She had been cautious for so long, learned to trust her instincts, and knew that freedom came with its own dangers. The stranger waited patiently, understanding her hesitation. He reminded her gently that the world was larger than the settlement that had held her captive, that there were people in it who could offer kindness, and that moving forward required both courage and wisdom. They entered the village quietly, choosing paths that avoided unnecessary attention. The last Apache woman's senses were alert. She noted the behavior of the villagers, the movements of children playing in the streets, and the small acts of care and community she witnessed. She felt a sense of connection to this new place, a reminder that humanity was not only cruel but also capable of warmth and compassion. She began to imagine a life where she could belong once again, a life where her voice could be heard, and her spirit could flourish without fear. In this village, she found work in simple ways at first, helping with chores, tending small gardens, and assisting the villagers in everyday tasks. She observed carefully, learning the rhythms of this new community, while slowly regaining her confidence. Each day brought a sense of normalcy that she had not felt since her capture, and each small act of contribution strengthened her belief in her own agency. She was no longer merely surviving, she was living, and the realization filled her with a quiet joy. The stranger remained close but gave her space to rebuild her independence. He understood that freedom was not just the absence of chains but also the ability to act with dignity and choice. She began to explore the surrounding hills, recalling the lessons of her youth and reconnecting with the land she loved. Every step, every observation, reinforced her sense of self and reminded her that the strength she had relied upon in captivity could now guide her toward a life of empowerment and self-determination. As days turned into weeks, the last Apache woman began to feel a profound sense of gratitude. She thought of the stranger who had risked his own safety to help her, whose quiet courage had been her lifeline during the darkest moments. She realized that trust, even when fragile, could create bonds strong enough to overcome fear and danger. The connection they shared was not born from necessity alone but from mutual recognition of each other's strength and humanity. She also reflected on her own growth. Captivity had not destroyed her, it had shaped her, teaching patience, careful observation, and inner fortitude. She had discovered the depth of her courage, the sharpness of her mind, and the resilience of her spirit. She had learned that freedom was not given lightly but earned through intelligence, bravery, and the ability to act decisively when the moment arrived. These lessons would guide her for the rest of her life, a foundation for navigating challenges with dignity and strength. One morning, as she walked along a stream near the village, she paused to watch the reflection of the sun on the water. It shimmered like a promise, reminding her that life, though unpredictable and sometimes cruel, could also be beautiful and generous. She thought of the hills of her childhood, of the songs her mother had taught her, and of the wind that had whispered through the canyons. These memories, once distant and painful, now carried a sense of hope and belonging. She realized that she had returned, not just to life, but to herself. The stranger, noticing her quiet contemplation, offered a small smile. They did not speak immediately, for words were unnecessary. The journey they had shared had created a bond stronger than conversation could convey. Together, they had faced danger, endured hardship, and emerged stronger and wiser. Their silent understanding, respect, and trust had become a testament to the power of human connection. Even in the most unlikely circumstances, the last Apache woman knew that the journey ahead would continue to hold challenges. There were still dangers in the world, and the memories of her captivity would never fully disappear. But she no longer felt powerless. She had reclaimed her agency, her courage, and her sense of self. She understood that freedom was not simply the absence of confinement, but the ability to act with confidence, intelligence, and compassion. With each passing day, she strengthened her resolve to live fully and honor the lessons she had learned. In the village, she also discovered the value of community. The villagers welcomed her cautiously at first, but her kindness, diligence, and quiet strength won their trust. She helped others with daily tasks, shared her knowledge of the land, and listened to their stories with empathy and respect. In return, they offered friendship, support, and a sense of belonging. For the first time since her capture, She experienced the warmth of human connection without fear, a feeling that nurtured her spirit and reinforced her sense of purpose. The stranger eventually prepared to continue his own journey, knowing that his role in her life had reached its natural conclusion. The last Apache woman understood this, and though she felt a pang of sadness, she also felt gratitude. He had helped her reclaim her freedom. But she had walked the path herself, step by step, building strength, courage, and wisdom. She had learned to trust, to act decisively, and to believe in her own abilities. His presence had been a guide, but her journey had always been hers alone. On the morning of his departure, they stood together in the clearing outside the village. She looked at him with respect and gratitude, knowing that his actions had saved her life. He looked at her with admiration, recognizing the extraordinary strength she had shown. Without words, they shared a final understanding that freedom, courage, and resilience were not given, but earned, and that each of them had played a vital role in the other's journey. Then, with a quiet farewell, he disappeared into the horizon, leaving her to embrace her reclaimed life fully. The last Apache woman continued to explore the hills, rivers, and forests around the village. She tended her garden, cared for animals, and shared her knowledge with others. Each day was a celebration of life regained, a reminder that she had survived the darkest hours and emerged stronger. She began to teach children the songs, stories, and lessons of her people, passing on the wisdom of courage, patience, and resilience. In doing so, she ensured that the spirit of her ancestors lived on, and that her own story of endurance and liberation would inspire future generations. As the seasons changed, she walked through the valleys and hills she had once feared she would never see again. The sun warmed her face, the wind carried the voices of the past, and the earth beneath her feet reminded her of her strength. She was no longer merely the last Apache woman. She was a woman who had endured, survived, and flourished. She had faced cruelty, captivity, and fear, and she had emerged free, whole, and empowered. In the quiet moments, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought of the stranger who had helped her, the lessons of her ancestors, and the courage that had carried her through each trial. She understood that freedom was not a destination, but a state of being, a recognition of her worth, the exercise of her courage, and the ability to live fully, with dignity and purpose. And so, the last Apache woman walked forward, fully alive, carrying the memories of the past, the lessons of her journey, and the promise of a future she would shape with her own hands. She was free, not only in body, but in spirit. And her life had become a testament to resilience, hope, and the enduring power of courage.